Associated Press news agency has leaked details of the potential ceasefire deal, which will reportedly be implemented in 3 stages. In stage 1, Hamas will release 33 Israeli captives. That's going to include female civilians, soldiers, children, and civilians above 50 years old. In return, Israel is going to free 50 Palestinian prisoners for each female soldier and 30 for each civilian hostage. Now, as part of this phase, Israel is also going to halt fighting and pull its forces back to the edges of Gaza. Displaced Palestinians will return to their homes and additional aid will flow into the Strip. The second phase is going to begin 42 days into the ceasefire, with a declaration of sustainable calm. Hamas will then release all remaining male captives, while Israel will negotiate the release of more Palestinian prisoners and withdraw all its troops from Gaza. The final stage will focus on long-term arrangements, including the return of bodies of Israeli captives and Palestinian fighters, implementing Gaza's reconstruction plan and reopening border crossings. Martin Griffiths is the former UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. He's joining us on set here in Doha. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.
Thank you very much.
In the details that we know so far, the list that the Associated Press has issued, there's one reference to additional aid flowing into the Strip, and that's it. And that doesn't address the amount of aid that needs to get in. And as far as I understand it, there are tons of aid still sitting across the border waiting to get in.
I think that's a real worry, because if we look at the last ceasefire, the only ceasefire that we've had, of course, in Gaza many, many months ago, one of the problems with it, and one of the reasons why it terminated fairly quickly, as I remember well, was that there were very ambitious levels of aspiration for humanitarian aid. Well, we understand that was an incentive, of course, and necessary. But now in this one, as we understand from these reported details, they're talking about 600 trucks a day, of which 50 are fuel. And I think the UN, at least my former colleagues, are saying it'd be very, very difficult to reach that level. We're talking about maybe 250 or 300. Now, there's a big gap. And the worry that we have is, number one, people will have been promised something that they don't get and that they desperately need. And so there'll be a dive in morale. And secondly, more importantly, last time, if there wasn't aid enough delivered on a certain day, then captives or hostages wouldn't be delivered. Do you remember that? So it's a condition for continuing the agreement. And we already know that it's going to be almost impossible to reach. So it's a major threat to what I think otherwise, in many ways, is a very good agreement if we ever get it.
Part of the problem also will be, even if the aid does get in, we've had, of course, reports over the several weeks of gangs operating within Gaza as well and looting the trucks and so on. There is going to be a security issue here, isn't there? Because with the level of, for want of a better phrase, distancing that might happen between Hamas fighters on the ground and Israel, that lessens the amount of control there might be over the security of that aid getting in.
I think it will be a real problem. And as far as I understand, and I may be wrong, I don't think the United Nations has been closely involved in these discussions. And we've had bitter experience, as you say, over these many months of promises made, promises not kept. And the gangsterism is, as I think I've said before, a natural consequence of the lack of aid, the lack of supplies, the lack of access to food and drink. Up comes the gangs, and nobody's policing them. The Palestinian police have been pushed away. And so who is going to actually contain and control the violence that is endemic now? The roads are still mined in many places. The other aspects is fantastic. You can go home. That's great at last. Of course, you'll be monitored for weapons, but you can begin to think about the future. My view is that these issues about humanitarian aid are also linked to the incredibly important issue of giving the people of Gaza hope. The hope has been destroyed, and hope kills people, the lack of it, as you know. And I think there will be a problem of the possibility that Israel will go back to war, never mind its withdrawals. They've retained the right to do that, as you know. The problem that there are 2 fundamentally different objectives for the agreement. Obviously, for Israel, it's about hostage release, perfectly understandable and very necessary. And for Hamas and the Palestinian people, it's about Palestinian governance and a future state. These are not the same objectives. And I know from mediating that if you don't have objectives aligned, that's when the ambiguities in the wording of the agreements go down, force problems. And then finally, I'm not aware yet of how inevitable breaches will be managed in terms of how to respond. Don't let it break the whole agreement. So, it's easy to be negative. I mean, it's interesting that Lebanon has really, despite breaches, survived, hasn't it? And it was a very, very welcome, rare moment when dialogue worked. This is another moment where dialogue could work. Great thanks to the two parties, Israel and Hamas. Great thanks to the mediators, of course, Qatar here, Egypt and the US. But I've myself fallen foul in the past of seeking an agreement to happen, seeking the page to be signed, without spending too much time worrying about the immediate consequences and the way in which it might go wrong. When an agreement fails, it takes you backwards. It's not zero. So we hope and we pray.
You said that hope was fundamental for the Palestinian people, particularly those in Gaza. Nevertheless, from what you're saying, that depends very much on the strength of whatever agreement and the consistency of whatever agreement remains. And monitoring that agreement, given the fact that you've been in the position of negotiating this kind of thing in the past, must be very difficult. How do you monitor something like this to make sure that both sides, neither of whom trusts each other, are actually adhering to the agreement?
I think it's a hugely important point. I was being reminded today about the work that Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN, did, and I worked with him and for him in different ways, in which he would always put monitoring up front and early, because he knew what you've just been saying, the perils otherwise. And what we've also learned about monitoring, and I've had many ceasefires that have usually failed, by the way, that I've been involved in, you need the monitoring to include the local people. Of course you do. They have ground truth. It's not just about strong forces coming in and making sure that there's an arbitration process. We need to know what's happening. Are the people finally getting the aid? Are they safely going back to northern Gaza? All these things. And what is the assurance that that second phase that you were describing earlier will actually come to pass? It's a really tough one. But, any agreement at this point, your reporting, which is so unique, of course, on Gaza and the West Bank, is telling all of us very clearly that the people desperately want this. So we shouldn't, pour water over it. We should be hoping, as the Norwegian Foreign Minister said today, that there will come a time soon that we can celebrate. But then then the problems start once it's signed. And that will be the first test. The first breach of these extensive agreements, very complicated agreements on timing and numbers. When that happens, what do? Who really speaks out? The role of the media is, of course, very important on that.
I want to actually take you down the road a little bit, and let's assume that the initial stages of the ceasefire hold, and ultimately that leads to some sort of full cessation of hostilities. There has to be some sort of political structure in Gaza in order to be able to run it. Is there something that you have in your mind, a structure that you think might serve the people of Gaza, as opposed to running the risk of becoming essentially a vassal government for either the Israelis or any other interested parties?
Yes. I've thought about this a lot. I had hoped very much and spoke to my boss, the Secretary General of the United Nations, a lot about whether the UN could provide a service of this kind. I was in Kosovo in 1999 when the UN provided that protectorate service, in effect, for administering Kosovo while it got its political act together. But as Guterres said, there's no chance of the UN being involved like that. I mean, they're not popular in certain places. But the idea then of a hybrid arrangement, which basically is loyal to the principle of Palestinian governance, is able to reinforce it with international support, maybe troops and security, but still under the aegis of the Palestinian entitlement, the Palestinian right and the freedom of peoples. there could be a way, because I don't think it can happen straight away. I know Hamas and Fatah have been talking, as you know. That's important. But the Palestinian Authority, which I fervently want to see in charge, has been depleted and undermined and isn't very strong. So I think you need to have a transition. We're seeing this in Syria, but a transition which has clear ambitions for the two states. I'm sorry, it's still the only solution, whatever people say, and resolves the continuing contradiction between Israel's aspirations for these lands and, in a sense, the world's aspirations for these lands. And the region, in terrible chaos and suffering, as well as hope now in Syria, will be watching like a hawk, won't they? Are Arabs to be sidelined again? And so it will have an impact. As I said, what happens in Gaza does not stay in Gaza. It will be noticed. You will be reporting it. And I thank God for that. So yes, a hybrid arrangement. We haven't seen any clear identification of what is proposed. I think we've heard a lot about behind-the-scenes discussions, the Emirates and the US and Israel, but not an accountable process of discussion. That, I think, is much, much more fundamental a need now because of this potential ceasefire, even than it was before. It's the harbinger of hope.
Martin Griffiths, thank you very much indeed for being with us on Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.